Marcus Williams adjusted his expensive tie as he stepped into the sleek glass elevator of Meridian Corp's 42nd floor. The numbers climbed steadily, each floor representing another rung on his carefully constructed ladder to success. At 35, he had already achieved what most people could only dream of: a corner office, a seven-figure salary, and the kind of influence that made board members listen when he spoke. His reflection in the elevator's polished steel showed a man who had everything under control: sharp suit, confident posture, and the kind of smile that had closed million-dollar deals. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, revealing the executive floor where power players moved like chess pieces across marble floors. Marcus strode through the corridors with the easy confidence of someone who belonged there, nodding curtly to colleagues who greeted him with a mixture of respect and wariness that his reputation commanded. He was known for being brilliant, ruthless when necessary, and completely focused on results. People either wanted to be him or wanted to stay out of his way. As he approached his office, Marcus noticed a small commotion near the reception area. His assistant, Janet, was speaking in hushed tones with someone he couldn't quite see, a woman with dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, wearing what appeared to be the standard-issue uniform of the building's cleaning staff. Marcus barely glanced in their direction as he swept past, his mind already focused on the morning's first meeting with the acquisition team. "Mr. Williams," Janet called out, her voice carrying the slight tension that meant she was about to deliver news he wouldn't want to hear. The new night shift supervisor would like to introduce herself. Marcus paused at his office door, his hand already on the handle. He turned slightly, his expression showing the kind of polite but distant interest he reserved for people who weren't directly relevant to his success. The woman stepped forward, and, for the first time, Marcus actually looked at her. She appeared to be in her early 30s, with tired eyes that seemed older than her years. Her uniform was clean, but worn, and she carried herself with a quiet dignity that was somehow at odds with her position. When she spoke, her voice was soft but clear, carrying the faint trace of an accent Marcus couldn't quite place. "Good morning, Mr. Williams. I'm Elena Rodriguez, the new night shift supervisor for this floor. I wanted to introduce myself and let you know that if you ever need anything after hours, I'll be here to help." Marcus nodded absently, already mentally dismissing the interaction. "Right, Elena. Good to meet you." His tone was polite, but clearly indicated that the conversation was over. He didn't notice the way her eyes flickered slightly at his casual dismissal, or how her hands tightened almost imperceptibly around the clipboard she was holding. "I hope you have a good day, sir," Elena said quietly, stepping back as Marcus disappeared into his office. Janet watched the exchange with a slight frown. She had been Marcus's assistant for 3 years and had learned to read his moods and motivations like a weather forecaster reading storm clouds. While she admired his professional abilities, she sometimes worried about his tendency to view people as either useful or invisible, with very little middle ground. Inside his office, Marcus was already deep in preparation for his day. His desk was a monument to organized efficiency. 3 monitors displaying market data, earnings reports, and email threads that would determine the fate of companies and careers. A stack of contracts waited for his review, each one representing another step toward his ultimate goal of securing a seat on the board of directors before his 40th birthday. The morning flew by in a blur of meetings, conference calls, and strategic decisions. Marcus moved through his schedule with the precision of a Swiss watch, each interaction calculated to advance his position or protect his interests. He barely thought about the cleaning supervisor who had introduced herself earlier. She was just another face in the background of his corporate world, as forgettable as the security guards or maintenance staff who kept the building running but never appeared on organizational charts. During lunch, Marcus met with his mentor, Richard Hawthorne, a silver-haired veteran of corporate warfare who had taken Marcus under his wing early in his career. They sat in the executive dining room, a sanctuary of leather and mahogany where the company's elite gathered to discuss strategy over perfectly prepared meals. "You're doing well, Marcus," Richard said, cutting into his steak with surgical precision. "The Henderson acquisition was masterful. You got the instincts for this business." Marcus felt the familiar warmth of validation from someone whose opinion he valued. "Thank you, Richard. I learned from the best. There's something I want to discuss with you," Richard continued, lowering his voice slightly. "The board is considering several candidates for the new vice president position that's opening up. Your name is definitely in the running, but there are other factors to consider. Marcus leaned forward, his attention sharpening. This was what he had been working toward for years, a chance to join the company's inner circle and gain real power over its direction. What kind of factors? Marcus asked, though he was fairly certain he knew the answer. Corporate politics were a game he had mastered early, understanding that success often depended as much on perception and relationships as on actual performance. Well, there's your track record, which is exemplary. Your vision for the company's future, which aligns well with where the board wants to go. But there's also the question of leadership style and how you're perceived by the entire organization, not just the C-suite. Marcus nodded, though privately he wondered why the opinions of lower-level employees should matter when it came to strategic decision-making. He had always believed that leadership meant making tough choices that others couldn't or wouldn't make, even if those choices weren't always popular. The rest of the day passed in its usual rhythm of high-stakes meetings and complex negotiations. As evening approached and the office began to empty, Marcus found himself staying later than usual, working on a presentation that could make or break his chances for the promotion Richard had mentioned. The floor grew quiet except for the soft hum of computers and the distant sound of elevator doors opening and closing. Around 9 o'clock, Marcus realized he was hungry and remembered that he had skipped dinner. The executive dining room was closed, and the building's cafeteria shut down hours earlier. He was about to call for a delivery when he remembered that the night shift staff sometimes kept coffee and basic snacks available for employees working late. He walked through the dimly lit corridors toward the service area, passing the offices of colleagues who had long since gone home to their families. The building felt different at night, larger somehow, with shadows that seemed to stretch further than they should. Marcus rarely stayed this late, preferring to maintain a strict work-life balance that allowed him to network at social events and maintain the relationships that were crucial to his advancement. As he rounded a corner, he heard the soft sound of someone humming. Following the sound, he discovered Elena Rodriguez restocking a supply closet, her movements efficient and practiced. She looked up when she heard his footsteps, and Marcus was surprised to see that her tired expression from the morning had been replaced by something more alert and focused. "Mr. Williams," she said, straightening up. "Working late tonight?" "Yes, big presentation tomorrow," Marcus replied, feeling slightly awkward at being caught wandering the halls in search of snacks. "I don't suppose there's anything to eat around here." Elena smiled, and Marcus noticed for the first time that it was a genuinely warm expression that transformed her entire face. "Actually, yes. The night staff keeps a small kitchen area stocked with basic supplies. Nothing fancy, but there are sandwiches and soup if you're interested." She led him to a small break room that Marcus had never noticed before, tucked away behind the main elevator bank. It was simple but clean, with a table, a few chairs, and a small kitchenette that looked like it had been assembled from donated equipment. Elena opened a refrigerator and pulled out a wrapped sandwich and a container of homemade soup. "Turkey and Swiss and my grandmother's recipe for chicken soup," she said, setting them on the counter. "Would you like me to heat up the soup?" Marcus was surprised by the gesture and by the fact that she seemed to have anticipated his needs. "That's very kind of you, but I don't want to impose." "It's no imposition," Elena said, already moving to warm the soup in a small microwave. "Taking care of the people in this building is part of my job, whether it's during the day or at night." As she worked, Marcus found himself studying her more carefully than he had that morning. There was something about her movements that spoke of competence and care, attention to detail that he recognized and appreciated in his professional life. When she handed him the steaming bowl of soup and the sandwich, he was struck by the simple kindness of the gesture. "Thank you," he said, and meant it. "This smells incredible." Elena busied herself cleaning the small kitchen area while Marcus ate. The soup was indeed excellent, rich and flavorful in a way that reminded him of meals from his childhood, before his life had become consumed by quarterly reports and strategic planning. He found himself relaxing for the first time all day, the tension in his shoulders easing as he sat in the simple break room. "Have you been with the company long?" Marcus asked, making conversation partly out of politeness and partly out of genuine curiosity. Elena paused in her cleaning, her hands stilling on the counter. "About 6 months in this position," she said carefully. "But I've worked for the building management company for several years. And before that," there was another pause, longer this time, and Marcus sensed he had touched on something sensitive. "Various things," Elena said finally. "I've always believed that honest work is honest work, regardless of what form it takes." Marcus nodded, though privately he reflected on how different their perspectives must be. His own career had been a carefully planned ascent through increasingly prestigious positions, each step calculated to build toward his ultimate goals. He couldn't imagine the kind of uncertainty that must come with moving from job to job, never knowing what the future might hold. They talked for a few more minutes about neutral topics: the weather, the building, the challenges of working night shifts. Marcus found Elena to be articulate and thoughtful, with insights that suggested she observed more about the people and dynamics around her than most people in her position would be expected to. When he finished eating, Marcus thanked her again and returned to his office, feeling oddly refreshed by the brief human connection. He worked for another 2 hours, polishing his presentation and preparing for what could be the most important meeting of his career. As he finally gathered his things to leave, he made a mental note to remember Elena's kindness when he wrote his monthly commendation reports. The next morning brought a flurry of last-minute preparations and pre-meeting strategy sessions. Marcus's presentation was scheduled for 10 o'clock, and he spent the early hours refining his slides and rehearsing his key talking points. Janet had arranged for the conference room to be set up exactly as he preferred, with water glasses positioned precisely and the lighting adjusted to show his charts and graphs to their best advantage. The presentation went even better than Marcus had hoped. The board members asked sharp questions that allowed him to demonstrate his deep understanding of the market and his vision for the company's growth. Richard Hawthorne caught his eye several times and nodded approvingly, and Marcus could sense the shift in the room's energy as the other executives began to see him not just as a talented employee, but as a potential peer. After the meeting, Marcus felt the kind of professional high that came from performing at the top of his abilities. He was confident that he had positioned himself well for the promotion, and the positive feedback from several board members confirmed his assessment. As he walked back to his office, he felt like he was floating slightly above the marble floors, carried by the momentum of his success. The feeling lasted through lunch and well into the afternoon, sustained by congratulatory emails and subtle hints from colleagues that his star was definitely rising within the organization. It wasn't until late in the day, when Janet knocked on his door with an unusual expression on her face, that Marcus's mood began to shift. "Mr. Williams," she said, holding a manila envelope that looked somehow official and ominous. "This came through internal channels about an hour ago. It's marked confidential and for your eyes only." Marcus took the envelope, noting that it bore the letterhead of the company's security department. His name was written across the front in block letters, with confidential stamped in red ink below. He waited until Janet had closed the door behind her before opening it, his mind already racing through possibilities of what might require such secrecy. Inside the envelope was a thin file folder containing what appeared to be a background check or personnel report. The header read, "Subject, Elena Rodriguez, Night Shift Supervisor, Floor 42, and was dated just 3 days earlier. Marcus frowned, wondering why he would be receiving a security report about a cleaning supervisor, but his curiosity was stronger than his confusion. As he began to read, his frown deepened into something approaching shock. The first page contained basic biographical information, but it was unlike anything he had expected. Elena Rodriguez, he learned, held a master's degree in international business from Columbia University and had graduated summa cum laude. She spoke 5 languages fluently and had spent several years working in various capacities for international development organizations. Marcus set the file down for a moment, trying to reconcile this information with the woman who had served him soup in a break room the night before. He picked up the file again and continued reading, each page revealing another layer of complexity that challenged everything he thought he knew about Elena Rodriguez. The report detailed her previous employment with a prestigious consulting firm, where she had specialized in emerging markets and had been instrumental in developing strategies for expansion into Latin American countries. Her supervisors had consistently rated her performance as exceptional, and she had been on track for partnership when she had suddenly resigned 3 years earlier. The reason for her resignation was buried in the middle of the file, written in the dry, clinical language of official reports. Elena's husband, Dr. Miguel Rodriguez, had been diagnosed with early-onset Alzheimer's disease at the age of 38. unable to afford the specialized care he required while maintaining her demanding travel schedule. Elena had left her career to become his full-time caregiver. Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach as he continued reading. The report detailed the progression of Miguel's illness and Elena's struggle to balance caregiving responsibilities with the need to maintain some form of income. She had taken a series of part-time and night jobs that would allow her to be home during the day, slowly working her way down from positions that utilize her education and experience to ones that simply paid the bills. The file included financial records that painted a stark picture of medical debt and dwindling savings. Elena had sold their home, liquidated their retirement accounts, and exhausted her professional network in search of help and resources. The night supervisor position at Meridian Corp was the latest in a series of jobs she had taken simply because the hours allowed her to care for her husband during his most difficult periods. But it was the final page of the report that hit Marcus like a physical blow. Miguel Rodriguez had died 6 weeks earlier, leaving Elena alone with overwhelming debt and the emotional devastation of losing the person she had sacrificed everything to care for. The report noted that she had returned to work just 3 days after the funeral, needing the income to begin rebuilding her shattered life. Marcus sat in his leather chair, staring at the file in his hands, feeling as though the world had shifted beneath him. The woman he had dismissed so casually that morning, the person he had barely noticed despite her kindness and professionalism, had been carrying a burden that he couldn't even begin to imagine. While he had been focused on presentations and promotions, Elena had been living through a tragedy that had cost her everything she had worked for and everyone she loved. He thought about their conversation the night before, about her quiet dignity and the way she had taken care of him without any expectation of recognition or reward. He realized now that her tired eyes held a depth of experience and loss that made his own professional challenges seem trivial by comparison. The woman who had served him homemade soup had been supporting a dying husband while working nights to pay for medical care that ultimately couldn't save him. Marcus closed the file and leaned back in his chair, feeling a strange mixture of shame and something he couldn't quite identify. For the first time in years, he found himself questioning not just his assumptions about Elena Rodriguez, but his assumptions about the people who moved through the background of his carefully constructed world. How many other stories was he missing? How many other lives was he overlooking in his relentless focus on his own advancement? The rest of the afternoon passed in a haze of distraction. Marcus tried to focus on his usual tasks, but his mind kept returning to the file and to the implications of everything he had learned. When evening came and the office began to empty once again, he found himself staying late not because of work demands, but because he needed time to process what he had discovered. Around 8 o'clock, he heard the soft sounds of the night shift beginning their work. Somewhere on the floor, Elena Rodriguez was starting another shift, cleaning offices and maintaining the environment that allowed people like Marcus to pursue their ambitions. But now he knew that she was doing so while grieving the loss of everything that had once mattered to her, and somehow finding the strength to treat even casual acquaintances with kindness and respect. Marcus stood at his office window, looking out at the city lights that stretched to the horizon, and wondered what else he had been missing in his relentless pursuit of success. The promotion he had wanted so desperately that morning suddenly seemed less important than the questions that Elena's story had raised about the kind of person he had become and the kind of leader he wanted to be. As he finally gathered his things to leave, Marcus made a decision. He would find Elena Rodriguez and somehow acknowledge what he had learned, though he wasn't yet sure what form that acknowledgement should take. He knew that his comfortable assumptions about people and their circumstances had been shattered, and there was no going back to the casual dismissal that had characterized his behavior that morning. The elevator carried him down through the floors of Meridian Corp., each number marking not just his descent through the building, but his descent into a new understanding of the complexity and dignity of lives he had never bothered to notice. When the doors opened onto the lobby, Marcus walked out into the night air feeling like a different person than the one who had confidently ascended that same elevator just 12 hours earlier. Tomorrow, he would have to figure out how to bridge the gap between the assumptions he had made and the reality he had discovered. Tonight, he simply needed to sit with the knowledge that kindness and strength could exist in places he had never thought to look, and that his own success meant nothing if it came at the cost of his ability to see the humanity in the people around him. Marcus arrived at the office the next morning earlier than usual, his mind still reeling from the revelations in Elena's file. The marble lobby felt different somehow, as if the very foundations of the building had shifted overnight. He found himself noticing details he had never paid attention to before. The security guard's tired smile, the way the maintenance staff moved efficiently through their morning routines, the quiet dignity of people whose work kept the corporate machine running but who rarely received recognition for their contributions. The elevator ride to the 42nd floor felt longer than usual, each floor giving Marcus more time to think about what he was going to say when he encountered Elena again. He had rehearsed several approaches during his restless night, but none of them felt adequate to bridge the enormous gap between his previous dismissal of her and his newfound understanding of her situation. Janet was already at her desk when Marcus arrived, her usual efficiency evident in the neatly arranged stack of morning briefings and the steaming cup of coffee that waited for him. She looked up as he passed, noting something different in his demeanor that she couldn't quite identify. "Good morning, Mr. Williams. How did you sleep after yesterday's presentation? I've been getting very positive feedback from the board members' offices." Marcus paused at his office door, realizing that the promotion he had been so focused on yesterday now felt like it belonged to a different version of himself. "Thank you, Janet. The feedback is encouraging." He hesitated for a moment, then asked, "Do you happen to know Elena Rodriguez's schedule? The night supervisor who introduced herself yesterday." Janet's eyebrows raised slightly at the unexpected question. In 3 years of working for Marcus, she had never known him to follow up on routine staff introductions. She typically worked from 9 p.m. to 6 a.m., Sunday through Thursday. "Is there something specific you need from the night shift?" "No, nothing urgent," Marcus replied, though he wasn't sure that was entirely true. The need to somehow acknowledge what he had learned felt pressing in a way that had nothing to do with business objectives. "I just wanted to follow up on something." Inside his office, Marcus tried to focus on his regular responsibilities, but his attention kept drifting to the file that now sat locked in his desk drawer. He found himself wondering about the details that weren't in the official report. What Elena's life had been like before her husband's illness, what dreams she had been forced to abandon, how she found the strength to start over after losing everything that had defined her identity. The morning passed slowly, punctuated by meetings and calls that felt increasingly surreal. Marcus participated in discussions about quarterly projections and market strategies while his mind grappled with questions about human dignity and the invisible struggles of people he encountered every day. During a particularly intense negotiation session, he caught himself wondering about the personal circumstances of the opposing team's junior lawyer, a young woman whose nervous energy reminded him of his own early career anxiety. Lunch with Richard Hawthorne provided a welcome distraction, though Marcus found himself viewing their conversation through a different lens than usual. Richard was effusive in his praise for yesterday's presentation and hinted broadly that Marcus was now the front-runner for the vice president position. "The board was impressed not just with your technical knowledge, but with your presence," Richard said, gesturing with his wine glass to emphasize the point. "You have the kind of confidence that inspires trust and leadership." Marcus nodded, but privately wondered what Elena would think of his confident presence if she knew how completely he had misjudged her situation. "Richard, can I ask you something? In your experience, what makes the difference between a good executive and a great leader?" Richard leaned back in his chair, clearly pleased to be asked for wisdom. "Vision, certainly. The ability to see opportunities that others miss. Strategic thinking. But perhaps most importantly, the capacity to make tough decisions without being paralyzed by sentiment. What about understanding people? Really knowing the circumstances and motivations of the people whose work makes our success possible." Richard's expression grew slightly puzzled. "Well, yes, understanding your team is important. Knowing how to motivate key players, reading the political landscape. But you can't get bogged down in every individual's personal situation. Marcus, leadership requires a certain level of detachment. You have to see the bigger picture." Marcus found himself disagreeing, though he kept his thoughts private. The bigger picture, he was beginning to realize, might actually be composed of all the smaller individual pictures he had been trained to ignore. Elena's story had shown him that dismissing people based on their apparent position was not just morally questionable. It was also strategically short-sighted. The afternoon brought a revelation that crystallized his thinking. During a meeting about the company's diversity and inclusion initiatives, Marcus listened as his colleagues discussed programs designed to identify and develop talent from underrepresented backgrounds. The conversation was well-intentioned, but abstract, focused on metrics and compliance rather than real human potential. "We need to be more creative about where we look for talent," said Sarah Chun, the head of human resources. "Sometimes the best candidates come from unexpected backgrounds or non-traditional paths." Marcus thought immediately of Elena's master's degree from Columbia and her experience in international consulting. How many other talented individuals were working in positions that didn't reflect their capabilities, either by choice or by circumstance? How much potential was the company overlooking because it only recognized talent that followed conventional career trajectories? After the meeting, Marcus made an impulsive decision. Instead of returning to his office, he took the elevator down to the building management offices on the 15th floor. He told himself he was simply gathering information, but he knew his motives were more complex than that. The building management offices were a stark contrast to the executive floor, with utilitarian furniture and fluorescent lighting that cast everything in a harsh, practical glow. The receptionist, a middle-aged woman with graying hair and kind eyes, looked up in surprise when Marcus introduced himself. "Mr. Williams, from the 42nd floor? My goodness, we don't often get visits from the executive level. How can I help you today?" Marcus realized he hadn't prepared a plausible explanation for his presence. "I'm following up on some staffing matters related to the night shift. Specifically, I wanted to inquire about Elena Rodriguez's background and performance." The receptionist's expression warmed immediately. "Oh, Elena. She's wonderful. One of the most professional and dedicated supervisors we've ever had. Is she being considered for some kind of recognition? Because she certainly deserves it. Can you tell me more about her work here?" Marcus asked, genuinely curious about how Elena's colleagues viewed her. "Well, she's only been in the supervisor role for 6 months, but she's transformed the night shift operations on several floors. She's incredibly organized, speaks multiple languages, which helps with our diverse staff, and has this way of making everyone feel valued and supported. Just last month, she developed a new training program that reduced cleaning times while improving quality." Marcus felt a familiar recognition. The description sounded like someone with natural leadership abilities and business acumen. Has she ever expressed interest in other opportunities within the company? The receptionist hesitated. I've always felt that Elena was overqualified for her current position. She has this way of analyzing problems and developing solutions that reminds me more of a consultant than a cleaning supervisor. But she's never said anything about wanting to move into a different role. She seems very focused on doing her current job well." As Marcus rode the elevator back to his floor, he carried with him a growing conviction that Elena's situation represented more than just a personal tragedy. It was a systemic failure, not just his own failure to see her capabilities, but the organization's failure to create pathways for people whose circumstances had forced them into positions that didn't reflect their potential. The rest of the day passed in a blur of routine tasks and strategic planning, but Marcus found his attention divided between his official responsibilities and his growing determination to somehow address what he had learned. As evening approached and his colleagues began to leave for their homes and families, Marcus made the decision to stay late once again. Around 9:30, he heard the familiar sounds of the night shift beginning their work. This time, instead of waiting for a chance encounter, Marcus deliberately walked through the office areas where he knew Elena would be working. He found her in the conference room, where he had given his presentation the day before, carefully cleaning the massive table where board members had debated his future. "Good evening, Elena," he said quietly, not wanting to startle her. She looked up, her face showing mild surprise at seeing him again. "Mr. Williams, working late again, I see." Marcus nodded, but instead of making small talk, he found himself saying something he hadn't planned. "Elena, I owe you an apology." Her hands stilled on the cleaning cloth she was holding, and she studied his face with a new level of attention. An apology? For what? Marcus struggled to find the right words. How could he explain that he had learned about her background through a security file without revealing that such files existed? How could he acknowledge his previous dismissal of her without sounding patronizing or intrusive? "Yesterday morning, when you introduced yourself, I was dismissive. Not intentionally rude, but I didn't really see you. I made assumptions based on your position here, and I realize now that those assumptions were not only wrong, but also unfair." Elena set down her cleaning supplies and straightened to her full height, her expression unreadable. "What assumptions did you make, Mr. Williams?" The question hung in the air between them, forcing Marcus to confront the uncomfortable truth about his own prejudices. "I assumed that your job here reflected your capabilities and background. I assumed that because you were cleaning offices, that was all you were qualified to do. I'm ashamed to admit that I didn't see you as a complete person with your own story and your own expertise." For a long moment, Elena was silent, and Marcus worried that he had somehow made things worse. Then, unexpectedly, she smiled. Not the polite professional smile she had offered before, but something more genuine and complex. "Thank you for saying that," she said finally. "Most people don't realize they're making assumptions, let alone acknowledge them when they do." Marcus felt a wave of relief, but also a deeper recognition that this conversation was just the beginning of a much larger reckoning. "Can I ask you something? And please feel free not to answer if it's too personal." Elena nodded, settling into one of the conference room chairs with a grace that suddenly seemed entirely natural in the corporate setting. "How do you maintain such professionalism and kindness when people consistently underestimate you? Because I have a feeling that what happened with me yesterday happens to you regularly." Elena was quiet for a moment, considering her response. "I suppose I've learned that other people's perceptions say more about them than they do about me. I know who I am and what I'm capable of, regardless of what job I'm doing at any particular moment. And I've found that kindness costs nothing, but often reveals more about a situation than hostility would." Marcus was struck by the wisdom in her response, but also by the sadness that lurked beneath her composed exterior. "That's a remarkable perspective. I'm not sure I would handle similar circumstances with such grace." "Similar circumstances?" Elena asked, and Marcus realized he had inadvertently revealed that he knew more about her situation than their brief interactions would justify. He felt his face flush with embarrassment. "I'm sorry, that was presumptuous. I don't actually know anything about your circumstances. I was speaking hypothetically about dealing with being underestimated." Elena studied him carefully, and Marcus had the uncomfortable feeling that she was seeing right through his attempt at backtracking. "Mr. Williams, can I ask you something now?" Marcus nodded, bracing himself for whatever insight she was about to share. "Why are you here tonight? Not just working late, but specifically seeking me out to have this conversation? Yesterday you barely noticed I existed, and today you're apologizing for assumptions and asking about my perspective on professional relationships. What changed?" The directness of her question caught Marcus off guard, and he realized that Elena possessed the same kind of analytical mind that had made him successful in business. She wasn't going to accept vague explanations or corporate speak. She wanted the truth. "You're right to call me out on this," Marcus said, making a decision to be as honest as possible without revealing the security file. "Something happened today that made me realize I've been moving through my professional life with blinders on. I've been so focused on my own advancement and my own circle of colleagues that I've missed the complexity and potential of people I encounter every day. Meeting you yesterday, and especially your kindness last night, made me realize that I need to examine my assumptions about people and their circumstances." Elena listened intently, her expression thoughtful. "That's a significant realization for someone in your position. Most executives I've encountered over the years seem quite comfortable with their assumptions." "You've encountered many executives?" Marcus asked, genuinely curious. Elena smiled, and this time there was a hint of amusement in her expression. "Mr. Williams, I've been working in and around corporate environments for over a decade, in various capacities. You'd be surprised how many different perspectives you can gain on business culture depending on which side of the conference table you're sitting on, or whether you're sitting at it all." Marcus felt another piece of the puzzle click into place. Elena wasn't just observing his world from the outside. She had been part of it before, and her current position gave her a unique vantage point on the dynamics and assumptions that shape corporate behavior. "Elena," he said slowly, "would you be willing to have coffee with me sometime? Not here in the building, but somewhere we could have a real conversation about perspectives and assumptions and what I might be missing in my approach to leadership." She was quiet for so long that Marcus began to worry he had overstepped some boundary. Finally, she spoke. "Mr. Williams, I appreciate the gesture, but I have to ask, what exactly are you hoping to gain from such a conversation? Because if this is some kind of diversity initiative or an attempt to assuage guilt about privilege, I'm not interested in being your learning experience." The bluntness of her response stung, but Marcus recognized that it was entirely fair. He had approached this conversation with mixed motives, and Elena was perceptive enough to see through his uncertainty about his own intentions. "You're absolutely right to question my motives," he said, "and I'm not entirely sure I can give you a completely clear answer, because I'm still figuring out what I think and feel about all of this myself. But what I can tell you is that yesterday's interaction with you, brief as it was, changed something in my perspective. Not just about you specifically, but about how I see people and potential and the stories that exist beneath the surface of professional interactions." Marcus paused, choosing his words carefully. "I suppose what I'm hoping to gain is wisdom. A different way of seeing the world that might make me not just a more successful executive, but a better person and a more effective leader. And I suspect you have insights that I need to hear, whether or not that's comfortable for either of us." Elena stood up from her chair and walked to the conference room window, looking out at the city lights below. When she turned back to face Marcus, her expression was more open than it had been since their conversation began. "Mr. Williams, I'll make you a deal. I'll have coffee with you, but not to be your teacher or your guide to understanding the working class perspective. I'll have coffee with you as one professional to another, with the understanding that we both have something to learn from each other's experiences and insights." Marcus felt a surge of gratitude and something else, respect perhaps, or recognition of an intelligence and dignity that he was finally beginning to see clearly. "I would be honored to have that conversation, Elena, and I think I understand the distinction you're making." As Elena gathered her cleaning supplies and prepared to continue her rounds, Marcus realized that this conversation had marked a turning point not just in his understanding of Elena Rodriguez, but in his understanding of himself and the kind of leader he wanted to become. The promotion he had been so focused on suddenly seemed less important than the opportunity to learn from someone who had experienced both success and loss, privilege and struggle in ways that his own carefully planned career had never required him to navigate. Walking back to his office, Marcus felt the weight of new responsibilities settling on his shoulders. If he was going to pursue a relationship, professional or otherwise, with Elena Rodriguez, he was going to have to confront not just his assumptions about her, but his assumptions about himself and the values that had driven his success. The comfortable certainties that had once guided his decisions were beginning to crack, and he wasn't sure what would replace them. But for the first time in years, Marcus felt like he was asking the right questions, even if he didn't yet know the answers. And that, he realized, might be the beginning of the kind of wisdom that Elena had demonstrated in their brief conversation. The ability to remain open to learning, even when that learning challenged everything you thought you knew about yourself and your world. The next morning would bring new challenges and new opportunities to apply what he was beginning to understand. But tonight, as Marcus finally gathered his belongings and prepared to leave the office, he carried with him the memory of a conversation that had revealed more about leadership and character than any business school case study ever could. And somewhere in the building above him, Elena Rodriguez continued her work with the same quiet dignity and professional competence that she had shown from the beginning. But now Marcus saw those qualities for what they truly were, the mark of someone who had maintained her integrity and her humanity despite circumstances that would have broken many people. The real test, Marcus knew, would come in the days and weeks ahead, when he would have to decide whether this newfound awareness would translate into meaningful action, or whether it would fade back into the comfortable assumptions that had defined his professional life until now. But for tonight, it was enough to know that change was possible, and that sometimes the most important lessons came from the most unexpected teachers. 3 days later, Marcus found himself sitting in a small coffee shop 6 blocks from Meridian Corp, nervously checking his watch for the 3rd time in 5 minutes. He had chosen this particular place because it was far enough from the office to ensure privacy, but close enough that neither he nor Elena would have to travel far during what he knew was her limited free time between shifts and whatever personal responsibilities filled her days. The morning rush had subsided, leaving the coffee shop populated mostly by freelancers working on laptops and a few retired couples enjoying leisurely conversations over pastries. Marcus had arrived 15 minutes early, partly out of professional habit and partly out of anxiety about how this meeting would unfold. He had spent the better part of 3 days thinking about Elena's challenge to meet as equals, as professionals with mutual respect, rather than as some kind of educational exercise in diversity awareness. When Elena walked through the door at exactly 10 o'clock, Marcus was struck again by her quiet dignity and the way she carried herself with confidence despite her simple clothes and obvious fatigue. She had traded her cleaning uniform for jeans and a sweater, and without the context of the corporate environment, she looked like any other professional meeting a colleague for coffee. "Mr. Williams," she said as she approached his table, and Marcus stood to greet her. "Please call me Marcus. Mr. Williams feels too formal for this conversation." Elena smiled as she settled into her chair. "All right, Marcus. And thank you for suggesting someplace away from the office. It's easier to have honest conversations when we're not surrounded by the environment where our professional roles are so clearly defined." Marcus had ordered Elena a coffee based on his best guess at her preferences, but she politely declined and went to the counter to order her own, a simple black coffee that she paid for herself. The gesture was small, but significant, establishing from the beginning that this would be a conversation between equals, not a charitable gesture from someone in a position of power. When she returned to the table, Marcus found himself uncertain how to begin. All of his usual conversation starters seemed inadequate for the situation, and he realized that his social skills had been developed primarily for networking and business relationships, not for genuine personal connection with someone whose experience was so different from his own. "Elena," he began finally, "I want to thank you for agreeing to meet with me. I've been thinking a lot about our conversation the other night, and I realize that I'm approaching this from a position of profound ignorance about what it means to navigate professional life from your perspective." Elena sipped her coffee thoughtfully. "What specifically do you mean by my perspective? Because I want to make sure we're both clear about what we're discussing." Marcus appreciated her directness and the way she refused to let him make vague generalizations. "I suppose I mean the perspective of someone whose current job doesn't necessarily reflect their education, experience, or capabilities. Someone who has had to rebuild their career under difficult circumstances. Someone who sees corporate culture from both inside and outside the traditional power structure." "That's a more thoughtful answer than I expected," Elena said with a slight smile. "Most people in your position would either romanticize the dignity of hard work or patronize me with assumptions about limited opportunities and social barriers. The fact that you're acknowledging the complexity of the situation suggests you've been giving this some serious thought." Marcus felt both relief and curiosity at her response. "Can I ask what you've observed about corporate culture from your current vantage point that someone in my position might not see?" Elena leaned back in her chair, considering the question. "There are several things, actually. First, there's the invisible labor that keeps organizations running. Not just cleaning and maintenance, but emotional labor, problem solving, and institutional knowledge that never gets recognized because it comes from people who aren't considered knowledge workers. Second, there's the amount of potential talent that gets overlooked because it doesn't present itself in traditional packages or follow conventional career paths." She paused to take another sip of coffee, and Marcus found himself leaning forward, genuinely engaged by her analysis. "But perhaps most interesting from a business perspective," Elena continued, "is how much information flows through the support staff that never reaches executive levels. I know which departments are struggling with morale, which managers are having personal problems that affect their work, which teams are functioning well together, and which ones are barely holding together. I see the evidence in office spaces, in how people treat support staff, in the kinds of conversations that happen when people think they're not being observed." Marcus felt a chill of recognition. "You're describing a massive intelligence gap in most organizations." "Exactly. And it's a gap that exists partly because of hierarchy, but mostly because of assumptions about who has valuable insights and whose observations matter." Marcus thought about his own team and wondered how many problems he might have addressed earlier if he had access to the kind of information Elena was describing. "Give me an example, if you don't mind." Elena hesitated for a moment, then seemed to make a decision. "There's a senior manager on your floor, I won't name names, who has been struggling with what appears to be a serious personal crisis for the past 2 months. His office is frequently in disarray. He's been working much later than usual, and twice I've found evidence that he's been sleeping in his office. His assistant has been fielding an unusual number of personal calls and has seemed increasingly stressed. From a support staff perspective, it's clear that something is wrong and that it's affecting his work performance." Marcus ran through the senior managers on his floor, tried to identify who Elena might be describing. Has anyone in management acknowledged this situation? Not as far as I can tell. And that's not unusual. There seems to be an unspoken agreement in corporate environments that personal struggles should remain invisible, even when they're clearly affecting professional performance. But the cost of that invisibility often gets absorbed by support staff and junior employees who have to work around the problems without being able to address them directly. The conversation continued for over an hour, with Elena sharing observations and insights that challenged Marcus's understanding of how his organization actually functioned. She spoke about the informal networks that kept information flowing, the ways that cultural assumptions created blind spots in decision-making, and the hidden costs of high turnover in positions that were considered easily replaceable. Elena, Marcus said finally, I have to ask, given your background and your obvious analytical abilities, have you considered applying for positions that would better utilize your skills? For the first time since they had sat down, Elena's expression grew guarded. Marcus, I appreciate the question, but I think you're missing something important about my situation. Marcus waited, sensing that he was about to learn something crucial. The assumption that I should be pursuing a different career path suggests that you see my current work as temporary or suboptimal. But what if it's not? What if I've made deliberate choices about how I want to spend my time and energy, choices that prioritize different values and advancement and recognition? Marcus felt his assumptions being challenged once again. I apologize. I didn't mean to suggest that your current position was somehow lesser than other work. I know you didn't mean it that way, Elena said gently. But this is exactly what I mean about perspective. You can't imagine choosing a job like mine unless circumstances force you into it, because your definition of success is tied to advancement, recognition, and financial achievement. But there are other ways to define a meaningful career. Marcus found himself thinking about his own relentless pursuit of the vice president position and wondering what he had sacrificed in that pursuit. What does a meaningful career look like to you? Elena was quiet for a long moment, and Marcus sensed that his question had touched on something deeply personal. For the past 3 years, a meaningful career was one that allowed me to care for someone I loved while he was dying. Now it's one that allows me to rebuild my life on my own terms, without compromising my integrity or accepting charity disguised as opportunity. The raw honesty of her response hit Marcus like a physical blow. He realized that she had just revealed something profound about her personal history, something that explained not just her current circumstances, but her perspective on work, success, and human dignity. Elena, I'm so sorry for your loss, Marcus said quietly. I can't imagine what that experience must have been like. She nodded, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Thank you. Miguel was my husband. He was diagnosed with early-onset Alzheimer's when he was 38. I left my consulting career to care for him full-time, and when he died 6 weeks ago, I was left with nothing but debt and the need to figure out who I am without him. Marcus felt the full weight of his previous dismissal of Elena settling on his shoulders. While he had been focused on presentations and promotions, she had been living through a tragedy that had reshaped every aspect of her existence. The night shift supervisor job isn't my dream career, Elena continued, but it pays the bills and gives me time during the day to process my grief and start planning what comes next. It also allows me to maintain my sense of purpose and dignity while I figure out how to rebuild my life. Marcus struggled to find words adequate to the moment. I don't know what to say. Your strength and resilience are remarkable. Elena smiled, but there was steel in her expression. I'm not telling you this to elicit sympathy or admiration. I'm telling you because I want you to understand that people's circumstances are always more complex than they appear, and that assumptions about motivation and capability are usually wrong. The conversation shifted after Elena's revelation, becoming deeper and more personal. Marcus found himself sharing his own doubts about his career path and his growing recognition that success, as he had defined it, might be incomplete without a deeper understanding of human connection and service. Marcus, Elena said as they prepared to leave, I want to ask you something, and I hope you'll consider it carefully. Marcus nodded, bracing himself for another challenge to his thinking. What are you going to do with what you've learned? Because having insights about privilege and assumptions is easy compared to actually changing behavior and systems. Are you going to go back to your office and feel good about having had an enlightening conversation? Or are you going to find ways to act on what you've discovered? The question lingered in the air as they gathered their things and prepared to part ways. Marcus realized that Elena was holding him accountable not just for his past assumptions, but for his future choices. She was challenging him to prove that their conversation had been more than just an intellectual exercise. As they walked back toward the office building, Marcus made a decision that surprised him with its clarity and conviction. Elena, I want to ask you something, and I want you to know that I'm asking not out of guilt or charity, but out of genuine recognition of your abilities and insights. Elena slowed her pace, clearly curious about what he was going to say. Would you be interested in consulting with me on some organizational challenges I'm facing? Not as a favor or as some kind of diversity initiative, but as a professional engagement where I would pay you for your expertise and insights. Elena stopped walking entirely, studying his face with an intensity that made Marcus wonder if he had somehow offended her again. What kind of organizational challenges? She asked finally. I'm being considered for a promotion to vice president, which would give me oversight of several departments and the opportunity to influence company culture and policies. I'm realizing that I don't have the perspective or insights I need to be effective in that role. I need someone who can help me see blind spots, understand dynamics I'm missing, and develop strategies that account for the full complexity of how organizations actually function. Elena resumed walking, but Marcus could see that she was thinking carefully about his proposal. You're suggesting that I help you become a better leader? I'm suggesting that you help me become a more complete leader. Someone who makes decisions based on accurate information about how those decisions will affect all the people in the organization, not just the ones who sit at conference tables. They had reached the entrance to Meridian Corp, and Elena paused before responding. Marcus, I appreciate the offer, and I think your instincts are good. But I need you to understand something. If I agree to work with you in this capacity, I won't be your teacher or your guide to understanding the working class. I'll be your consultant, which means I'll challenge your assumptions, tell you things you don't want to hear, and expect you to take action on insights that might be uncomfortable or difficult to implement. Marcus felt a thrill of recognition at her terms. This was exactly the kind of relationship he needed, not someone who would confirm his existing beliefs or make him feel good about his good intentions, but someone who would push him to grow in ways that would make him more effective and more ethical in his leadership role. Elena, he said, I accept those terms, and I hope you'll accept the consulting arrangement because I think we could both benefit from working together. Elena extended her hand for a firm handshake that felt like the beginning of a partnership rather than the conclusion of a conversation. All right, Marcus, let's see what kind of leader you're capable of becoming. As Marcus rode the elevator back to his floor, he reflected on how profoundly his world had shifted in the course of a single week. The promotion he had wanted so desperately was now just one part of a larger transformation in how he understood leadership, success, and human potential. The woman he had dismissed as a cleaning supervisor had become a consultant whose insights could reshape not just his approach to management, but his understanding of what it meant to create value in the world. The challenges ahead would be significant. Marcus would have to learn to see his organization through Elena's eyes, to value insights that came from unexpected sources, and to make decisions that prioritize human dignity alongside financial performance. He would have to confront not just his own assumptions, but the systemic barriers that prevented people like Elena from being recognized for their full potential. But for the first time in his career, Marcus felt like he was pursuing goals that mattered beyond his own advancement. The partnership he was beginning with Elena Rodriguez represented more than just professional development. It was an opportunity to become the kind of leader who could see the complete picture of human potential and organizational effectiveness, rather than just the narrow slice that traditional corporate hierarchies revealed. As he settled back in his office and prepared for an afternoon of meetings and strategic planning, Marcus carried with him the memory of Elena's challenge and the exciting possibility that his future success might be measured not just by his own advancement, but by his ability to create opportunities for others to be seen, valued, and utilized for their full range of talents and insights. The real work, Marcus knew, was just beginning. But he had found a partner who could help him navigate the complex territory between good intentions and meaningful action, between awareness and implementation, between success as he had always defined it, and leadership as he was beginning to understand it could be. 2 weeks after their coffee meeting, Marcus found his world turned completely upside down in ways he never could have anticipated. Elena's consulting arrangement had begun with what seemed like simple observations about office dynamics and communication patterns, but it had quickly evolved into something far more transformative and challenging than either of them had expected. The first major revelation came during Elena's review of employee satisfaction surveys that had been gathering dust in HR files for months. While the executive team had dismissed the surveys as routine paperwork with predictably mediocre results, Elena's analysis revealed patterns that painted a stark picture of organizational dysfunction that no one in leadership had recognized. Marcus, Elena said during their second official consulting session, spreading several charts across his conference table, you have a retention crisis that's being masked by the way your organization tracks and reports turnover data. Marcus studied the charts, noting turnover rates that seemed relatively normal for their industry. These numbers don't look particularly alarming. We're within industry standards for most positions. Elena shook her head, pulling out a different set of calculations. That's because you're measuring turnover annually and focusing on voluntary versus involuntary departures. But look at this. She pointed to a timeline that showed departure dates mapped against employee performance reviews and department assignments. Your highest performing employees in support and junior management roles are leaving within 18 to 24 months consistently. They're not going to competitors. They're leaving corporate environments entirely. Some are starting their own businesses. Others are moving to nonprofit organizations. And several have taken early retirement despite being in their 30s and 40s. Marcus felt a chill of recognition as he studied Elena's analysis. Why would high performers leave stable, well-paying positions to take on that kind of uncertainty? Because, Elena said quietly, they've realized that their potential will never be recognized or utilized here. They're not leaving because of salary or benefits. They're leaving because of culture and opportunity structure. The conversation that followed forced Marcus to confront uncomfortable truths about Meridian Corp's internal dynamics. Elena had conducted informal interviews with several departing employees, and their feedback revealed a pattern of talented individuals who had grown frustrated with rigid hierarchies, limited advancement opportunities, and a culture that valued credentials and connections over performance and innovation. One of the most telling responses came from Jennifer Walsh in operations. Elena said, consulting her notes. She had developed a process improvement system that could have saved the company approximately $200,000 annually. When she presented it to her supervisor, she was told it was outside her role and that process improvement should come from management or external consultants. Marcus winced, remembering Jennifer as a competent but quiet employee who had left 6 months earlier for what her supervisor had described as personal reasons. 6 weeks after she left, the company hired an outside consultant for $15,000 to conduct a process improvement study for her department. The consultant's recommendations were nearly identical to Jennifer's original proposal. Elena's analysis didn't stop at retention issues. She had identified communication breakdowns between departments, resource allocation problems that were creating artificial scarcity and competition, and decision-making processes that excluded crucial information from frontline employees who understood operational realities better than many managers. The most significant issue, Elena concluded, is that you have a two-tier information system. Senior management makes strategic decisions based on reports and presentations, while operational staff deals with the actual implementation challenges that never get communicated upward effectively. Marcus found himself thinking about his own rise through the corporate hierarchy and wondering how many valuable insights he had missed because they came from people whose opinions he hadn't thought to solicit. Elena, if you were designing an organization from scratch, how would you structure communication and decision-making differently? Elena smiled, and Marcus recognized the expression of someone who had been hoping for exactly that question. I would create formal mechanisms for bottom-up information flow, not just top-down directives. I would establish cross-functional teams that include representatives from every level of the organization for major decisions. And I would implement recognition and advancement systems that reward innovation and problem-solving regardless of where they originate. Over the following week, Elena's consulting work began to have immediate and visible impacts on Marcus's leadership approach. He started attending meetings with different questions, seeking out perspectives from junior staff members, and challenging assumptions that had previously gone unexamined. The changes didn't go unnoticed by his colleagues, and reactions were mixed. Richard Hawthorne expressed concern during one of their regular lunch meetings. Marcus, I'm hearing some interesting feedback about your recent management style. Some people are saying you're spending too much time on operational details and employee feedback. While that's admirable in theory, there's a risk of getting bogged down in minutiae when you should be focusing on strategic vision. Marcus chose his words carefully, knowing that Richard's support was still crucial for his promotion prospects. I've been experimenting with different information sources to make sure my strategic decisions are grounded in operational reality. I think there's value in understanding how policies and initiatives actually function at ground level. That's true to a point, Richard said, but you have to be careful not to undermine the hierarchy or create expectations that every employee's opinion carries equal weight in decision-making. Part of leadership is making tough choices based on incomplete information. The conversation troubled Marcus because he recognized the wisdom in Richard's concerns while simultaneously feeling that his mentor's perspective was missing something crucial. Elena's insights had shown him that the information wasn't actually incomplete. It was just being filtered through systems that excluded valuable data and perspectives. The real test of Marcus's evolving leadership philosophy came during a crisis that erupted in the company's largest client account. Meridian Corp had been managing a complex international project for a telecommunications company, and problems had been mounting for weeks without reaching executive attention until a critical deadline was missed, potentially costing millions in penalties and threatening the entire relationship. Marcus found himself leading the crisis response team, and his first instinct was to follow traditional problem-solving protocols, gathering reports from department heads, analyzing financial impacts, and developing a recovery plan based on senior management input. But Elena's influence prompted him to take a different approach. Instead of starting with executive briefings, Marcus convened a meeting that included project managers, technical staff, customer service representatives, and administrative support personnel who had been directly involved in the troubled account. The meeting was unlike anything most of the participants had experienced in their corporate careers. I want to understand what actually happened with this project, Marcus began, not just what the reports say happened. I need perspectives from everyone who had direct contact with a client or direct knowledge of implementation challenges. What emerged from that meeting was a story that bore little resemblance to the sanitized reports that had been flowing upward through normal channels. The project had been troubled from the beginning due to unrealistic timelines that had been accepted by sales staff who didn't understand technical requirements. Communication with the client had been hampered by language barriers that had been acknowledged but never addressed. Resource allocations have been based on theoretical requirements rather than practical needs, leading to constant crisis management and, over time, stress. Most significantly, multiple staff members had identified problems and proposed solutions weeks earlier, but their concerns had been dismissed or lost in hierarchical communication chains. A junior project manager named David Kim had documented specific risks and mitigation strategies 3 weeks before the deadline crisis, but his report had never reached decision-makers because his immediate supervisor had judged it too technical for executive review. David, Marcus said during the meeting, can you walk us through your risk assessment and your proposed solutions? David looked nervously around the room, clearly uncertain about speaking up in front of senior management. Well, I identified 3 critical bottlenecks that were likely to cause delays, and I had suggestions for addressing each one. But I was told that changing project parameters would require client approval and executive sign-off, which would take too long. Marcus felt a familiar surge of recognition. The same kind of systems thinking and problem-solving ability that Elena possessed, being overlooked because it came from someone without formal authority or senior title. David, if you had been empowered to implement your recommendations 3 weeks ago, would we have avoided this crisis? Probably, David said quietly. The solutions weren't particularly complex or expensive. They just required flexibility in resource allocation and direct communication with client technical staff. The meeting continued for 3 hours, and by the end, Marcus had a completely different understanding of both the crisis and the systemic issues that had caused it. More importantly, he had identified several staff members whose insights and capabilities had been systematically underutilized by the organization's traditional management approaches. The recovery plan that emerged from this collaborative process was more comprehensive and realistic than anything Marcus could have developed through traditional executive briefings. Within 2 weeks, the client relationship had been not only salvaged, but strengthened as the telecommunications company expressed appreciation for Meridian Corp's willingness to acknowledge problems honestly and implement genuine solutions. The success of the crisis response didn't go unnoticed by the board of directors, and Marcus found himself receiving praise for his innovative management approach and effective crisis leadership. But privately, he knew that the real credit belonged to staff members like David Kim, whose expertise had been ignored until Elena's influence prompted him to seek out different perspectives. The experience crystallized Marcus's understanding of what Elena had been trying to teach him about organizational blind spots and hidden potential. The company was full of talented people whose capabilities weren't being recognized or utilized because they didn't fit traditional models of how expertise was supposed to present itself. During their next consulting session, Marcus shared his reflections on the crisis response with Elena. I keep thinking about how many other David Kims there might be in the organization and how much potential we're wasting because we don't have systems for identifying and developing talent wherever it exists. Elena nodded approvingly. That's exactly the right question. But now you have to decide what you're going to do about it. Because recognizing the problem is just the first step. Marcus had been thinking about exactly that question, and he had reached a conclusion that surprised him with its clarity. Elena, I want to propose something that might sound crazy, but I think it could transform how this company operates. Elena raised an eyebrow, clearly interested in what he was about to suggest. What if we created a formal innovation and talent development program that actively seeks out ideas and capabilities from every level of the organization? Not just a suggestion box or employee survey, but a real system for identifying, developing, and implementing innovations regardless of where they originate. That's not crazy, Elena said with a smile. That's exactly the kind of thinking that could give Meridian Corp a competitive advantage. But it would also require fundamental changes in how the organization thinks about hierarchy, authority, and decision-making. Marcus felt the familiar excitement of a strategic challenge, but this time it was tempered by a deeper understanding of the human complexities involved. I know it wouldn't be easy to implement. There would be resistance from managers who see it as threatening their authority, and skepticism from employees who have learned not to expect their ideas to be valued. Those are real challenges, Elena agreed. But they're not insurmountable if the program is designed thoughtfully and implemented with genuine commitment to changing culture, not just procedures. Over the next several days, Marcus found himself developing ideas for what such a program might look like, drawing on Elena's insights about organizational dynamics and his own understanding of corporate strategy. The more he thought about it, the more convinced he became that this kind of initiative could be the foundation of his leadership approach if he received the promotion to vice president. But he also recognized that proposing such a program would require him to take a significant professional risk. Traditional corporate culture didn't always reward innovation that challenged existing power structures, even when that innovation promised significant benefits. Marcus would have to decide whether he was willing to stake his career prospects on a vision of leadership that might be too progressive for Meridian Corp's current culture. The decision point came sooner than Marcus had expected. Richard Hawthorne called him into his office on a Friday afternoon with news that the board was ready to make their decision about the vice president position. Marcus, I wanted to give you a heads up that the board meeting is Monday morning, and your name is definitely being seriously considered. There's one final presentation opportunity. You'll have 30 minutes to outline your vision for the role and how you would approach the challenges facing the company. Marcus felt the familiar surge of competitive energy, but this time it was complicated by everything he had learned from Elena about leadership, potential, and organizational effectiveness. He realized that he had reached a crossroads where he would have to choose between playing it safe with a conventional approach that would likely secure the promotion, or taking a risk with innovative ideas that might transform the company, but could also be seen as too radical for his level of experience. That weekend, Marcus spent long hours walking through the city, thinking about Elena's challenges to his assumptions, and David Kim's overlooked expertise, and Jennifer Walsh's frustrated departure. He thought about the kind of leader he wanted to be and the kind of organization he wanted to help create. By Sunday evening, Marcus had made his decision. He would use his presentation to propose the innovation and talent development program, along with broader changes in how Meridian Corp identified and utilized human potential. It was a risk that could cost him the promotion, but it was also an opportunity to demonstrate the kind of leadership that Elena's insights had helped him understand. As Marcus prepared his presentation materials, he realized that regardless of the board's decision, his collaboration with Elena Rodriguez had already transformed him in ways that would influence every aspect of his career going forward. The question now was whether Meridian Corp was ready for the kind of leadership that their collaboration had revealed was possible. Monday morning would bring either vindication of his new approach to leadership or confirmation that his insights were ahead of their time. But Marcus had found something more valuable than a promotion in his work with Elena. He had discovered a vision of what leadership could be when it was grounded in genuine understanding of human potential and organizational effectiveness, rather than just traditional markers of success and authority. Monday morning arrived with a kind of crisp autumn air that seemed to promise either new beginnings or decisive endings. Marcus stood at his office window, watching the early commuter stream into the building below, and reflected on how dramatically his perspective had changed since the morning just 3 weeks earlier when Elena Rodriguez had first introduced herself. The confident executive who had dismissed her so casually seemed like a different person now, someone whose certainties about leadership and success had been replaced by questions that felt far more meaningful than any answers he had previously possessed. The board presentation was scheduled for 10 o'clock, giving Marcus 3 hours to make final preparations and manage the anxiety that had been building since he made the decision to stake his career on a vision that challenged everything Meridian Corp had traditionally valued. His presentation materials were ready, but Marcus knew that the real test would be his ability to articulate not just new policies and procedures, but a fundamental shift in how the organization understood human potential and competitive advantage. At 9:30, Marcus gathered his presentation materials and made his way to the executive conference room where his future would be decided. The same room where he had given his successful quarterly report 3 weeks earlier now felt like foreign territory, as if the walls themselves had shifted to accommodate his expanded understanding of what leadership could mean. The board members were already assembled when Marcus arrived, 12 senior executives and external directors whose combined experience represented decades of traditional corporate leadership. Richard Hawthorne offered an encouraging nod from his seat near the head of the table, but Marcus could see concern in his mentor's eyes about the unconventional approach he suspected Marcus might be planning. "Marcus," said Elizabeth Chun, the board chairwoman, "we're looking forward to hearing your vision for the vice president role and how you would address some of the strategic challenges facing Meridian Corp in an increasingly competitive marketplace." Marcus took his place at the presentation podium, feeling the weight of 12 pairs of eyes that would judge not just his ideas, but his readiness for executive leadership. For a moment, he considered abandoning his prepared remarks and delivering the kind of conventional strategic presentation that would almost certainly secure his promotion. Instead, he thought about Elena's challenge to act on his insights rather than simply feeling good about having gained them. "Thank you, MS. Chun, and thank you all for this opportunity," Marcus began, his voice steadier than he had expected. 3 weeks ago, I would have stood here and presented a traditional strategic plan focused on market expansion, operational efficiency, and financial performance. Those elements are certainly important, but I've recently discovered that we're missing a crucial component of competitive advantage that most organizations systematically overlook. Marcus clicked to his first slide, which displayed the retention analysis that Elena had prepared. "We have a talent utilization crisis that's costing us millions in lost productivity, missed innovations, and competitive disadvantage. But the problem isn't that we lack talented people. It's that we don't recognize or develop the talent we already have." For the next 20 minutes, Marcus presented Elena's findings about organizational blind spots, communication breakdowns, and systematic underutilization of employee capabilities. He shared case studies from the telecommunications project crisis, highlighting how valuable insights had been ignored until a crisis forced the organization to seek broader input. David Kim, a junior project manager, had identified and solved the critical problems 3 weeks before they became a crisis, Marcus explained. Jennifer Walsh had developed cost-saving innovations worth $200,000 annually before leaving for opportunities that would value her contributions. These aren't isolated incidents. They represent a pattern of organizational behavior that treats hierarchy as a substitute for expertise. Marcus could see mixed reactions around the table. Several board members looked intrigued by his analysis, while others appeared skeptical about what they might view as unnecessary complexity in management approaches. Richard Hawthorne's expression was carefully neutral, but Marcus sensed his mentor's concern about the direction of the presentation. The strategic opportunity, Marcus continued, is to create systematic mechanisms for identifying, developing, and utilizing talent regardless of formal titles or traditional credentials. I'm proposing an innovation and talent development program that would fundamentally change how we approach human capital management. Marcus outlined his vision for cross-functional innovation teams, formal channels for bottom-up communication, and advancement systems that rewarded problem-solving and innovation over tenure and credentials. He presented financial projections showing potential returns on investment through improved retention, increased efficiency, and competitive advantage through faster innovation cycles. This approach isn't just about employee satisfaction or diversity initiatives, Marcus emphasized. It's about competitive advantage through superior utilization of human intelligence and creativity. Organizations that can identify and develop talent faster than their competitors will dominate in increasingly complex markets. As Marcus concluded his presentation, he realized that the room had grown very quiet. The board members were studying his materials with intense concentration, but their expressions remained unreadable. Elizabeth Chun was the first to speak. Marcus, this is certainly a comprehensive analysis and an ambitious vision. Can you give us specific examples of how this approach would work in practice? Marcus felt a surge of confidence as he moved into the implementation details he had developed with Elena's guidance. Absolutely. For example, we would establish quarterly innovation forums where any employee could present improvement proposals directly to decision-makers. We would create mentorship programs that pair high-potential individuals with senior leaders regardless of departmental boundaries. And we would implement project rotation systems that allow people to demonstrate capabilities outside their current roles. Board member Thomas Wright raised a concern that Marcus had anticipated. This sounds like it could undermine management authority and create unrealistic expectations about advancement opportunities. That's a valid concern, Marcus replied, but I believe it reflects a misunderstanding about what effective management authority actually means. Authority based on position alone is fragile and inefficient compared to authority based on competence and results. The innovation program wouldn't eliminate hierarchy. It would make hierarchy more meaningful by ensuring that leadership positions are held by people who can actually identify and develop talent effectively. Marcus continued to field questions for another 15 minutes, drawing on examples from Elena's research and his own growing understanding of organizational dynamics. He could sense that several board members were beginning to see the potential in his approach, while others remained committed to more traditional management philosophies. Finally, Elizabeth Chun called an end to the question period. Thank you, Marcus. This has been a thought-provoking presentation. The board will deliberate and have a decision for you by the end of the week. As Marcus left the conference room, he felt a mixture of exhilaration and uncertainty. He had presented his authentic vision for leadership, but he had no idea whether the board would view his ideas as innovative or impractical. Richard Hawthorne caught up with him in the hallway, his expression reflecting the same uncertainty Marcus was feeling. That was certainly bold. Marcus, Richard said carefully, I hope you've accurately assessed the board's appetite for that level of organizational change. Marcus nodded, understanding his mentor's concern. Richard, I realized that I couldn't ask for a leadership position based on ideas I didn't actually believe in. If the board doesn't think these approaches are valuable, then maybe I'm not the right person for this role at this time. The rest of the week passed in a blur of routine meetings and projects, but Marcus found it difficult to concentrate on conventional business matters while waiting for news that would shape the direction of his career. He continued his consulting sessions with Elena, partly because their work had become genuinely valuable regardless of his promotion prospects, and partly because her perspective helped him maintain clarity about his goals and values. How do you feel about the presentation? Elena asked during their Thursday evening meeting. Marcus considered the question carefully. I feel like I presented the most authentic version of leadership I'm capable of right now. Whether or not that's what Meridian Corp wants in a vice president, I'm proud of the vision I shared. Elena smiled with what appeared to be genuine approval. That's exactly the right way to think about it. You've grown into someone who leads with conviction rather than just ambition. Friday afternoon brought the call Marcus had been anticipating and dreading. Elizabeth Chen's assistant requested his presence in the boardroom at 4 o'clock for the decision announcement. Marcus arrived to find the full board assembled once again, their expressions offering no hints about their conclusions. Marcus, Elizabeth Chun began, "We want to thank you again for your presentation earlier this week. It generated extensive discussion and debate among the board members." Marcus felt his stomach tighten, recognizing the formal tone that usually preceded disappointing news in corporate settings. "Your analysis of organizational challenges was insightful, and your proposed solutions demonstrated creative thinking about management approaches," Chun continued. "However, the board has concluded that implementing such a comprehensive change program would require more organizational stability and buy-in than we currently have." Marcus nodded, trying to mask his disappointment while understanding the board's perspective. Traditional organizations often struggled with innovations that challenged established power structures, even when those innovations promised significant benefits. Therefore, Chun said, "We've decided not to fill the vice president position at this time. Instead, we're creating a new role, Director of Organizational Development and Innovation. We're offering you that position with a mandate to pilot the programs you outlined and demonstrate their effectiveness before we consider broader implementation." Marcus felt a surge of surprise and excitement that completely replaced his initial disappointment. The board hadn't rejected his vision. They had created an opportunity for him to prove its value through implementation rather than just presentation. The role would report directly to the board, Chun explained, with budget authority and staff resources to develop pilot programs. "If your approaches demonstrate measurable results, we would consider expanding them company-wide and potentially creating the vice president role you originally sought." Marcus looked around the table, seeing expressions that ranged from curious support to cautious skepticism. "Ms. Chun, I'm honored by the offer and excited about the opportunity to prove these concepts through practical application. There's one additional element," Chun said with a slight smile. "The board was particularly impressed by your analysis of talent utilization issues. We understand that your insights came partly from consulting with external resources. We'd like you to have flexibility in building your team, including the ability to hire consultants or convert existing staff members who demonstrate the kind of capabilities your program is designed to identify." Marcus immediately thought of Elena and David Kim and Jennifer Walsh's replacement, wondering if the board was deliberately creating openings for unconventional hiring approaches. "I appreciate that flexibility. I believe the most effective organizational development comes from diverse perspectives and experiences." The meeting concluded with logistical discussions about timeline, reporting structure, and initial resource allocation. As Marcus left the boardroom, he realized that the outcome exceeded even his most optimistic expectations. Instead of being promoted into an existing role with traditional constraints, he had been empowered to create something entirely new. That evening, Marcus called Elena to share the news and discuss what the new role might mean for their collaboration. "Elena, I have an offer to make, and I want you to know that it's based purely on professional merit and the value you've already demonstrated," Marcus began. "I'm listening," Elena replied with cautious interest. "The board has created a Director of Organizational Development and Innovation position for me, with a mandate to implement the programs we've developed together. I want to offer you a permanent role as Senior Consultant for Talent Development, with competitive compensation and the opportunity to help reshape how this organization identifies and utilizes human potential." Elena was quiet for so long that Marcus wondered if the connection had been lost. Finally, she spoke. "Marcus, 3 weeks ago, I was a night shift supervisor who you barely acknowledged. Now you're offering me a senior consulting role that could change my career trajectory entirely. How do I know this isn't just guilt or good intentions that will fade when the novelty wears off?" Marcus had anticipated the question and had spent considerable time thinking about his answer. "Elena, you've seen me make assumptions and mistakes throughout this process. But you've also seen me learn from them and change my behavior based on evidence rather than just intentions. The value you've brought to my understanding of leadership and organizational dynamics is measurable and substantial. This isn't charity, it's recognition of expertise that this organization needs. And if I accept this role, what would you expect from me?" Marcus smiled at the directness of her question, recognizing the same analytical approach that had made their collaboration so effective. "I would expect you to continue challenging assumptions, identifying blind spots, and developing systems that help us find and utilize talent wherever it exists. I would expect you to be as direct and uncompromising about organizational effectiveness as you've been with me personally. Elena's acceptance came with conditions that demonstrated her continued commitment to integrity and results over comfort or convenience. She would maintain her evening schedule for 2 more weeks to ensure a smooth transition for the night shift, and she would insist on measurable performance standards for her new role that would justify continued employment based on results rather than relationships. 6 months later, Marcus stood in the same conference room where he had delivered his risky presentation, but this time he was presenting the results of pilot programs that had exceeded every projection and expectation. Employee retention in participating departments had improved by 35%. Innovation proposals from frontline staff had generated cost savings and efficiency improvements totaling over $2 million. The telecommunications client had become a reference account that was helping Meridian Corp win new business based on their reputation for responsive and innovative service. Most significantly, the pilot programs had identified and developed talent throughout the organization in ways that were transforming departmental performance and employee satisfaction. David Kim had been promoted to project director and was leading the implementation of his process improvement systems across multiple client accounts. 3 former support staff members were now in management roles after demonstrating leadership capabilities through the innovation forum process. Elena Rodriguez had become one of the most respected consultants in the organization, sought out by department heads who were struggling with team dynamics or performance challenges. Her insights had proven consistently valuable not just for talent development, but for strategic planning and operational improvement. The board's decision about the original vice president position came at the end of Marcus's presentation. Elizabeth Chun stood to address both the results and the future direction. Marcus, the organizational development and innovation program, has demonstrated value that exceeds our most optimistic projections. The board has voted unanimously to expand these approaches company-wide and to create the vice president position you originally sought, with responsibility for organizational development across all departments. Marcus felt a surge of vindication and excitement, but it was tempered by a deeper appreciation for the collaborative process that had made the success possible. Ms. Chun, I'm honored by the promotion, but I want to emphasize that these results represent team accomplishments rather than individual achievement. The insights and capabilities that drove our success came from throughout the organization. As Marcus left the boardroom with his promotion confirmed and his vision validated, he reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. 3 weeks of conversations with Elena Rodriguez had transformed not just his understanding of leadership, but his definition of success itself. The promotion he had originally wanted as a symbol of personal achievement had become a platform for creating opportunities for others to be recognized and develop for their full potential. That evening, Marcus and Elena met at the same coffee shop where their professional relationship had begun, but now as colleagues celebrating a shared success that had implications far beyond their individual careers. Elena, Marcus said, raising his coffee cup in a mock toast, I want to thank you for seeing possibilities in me that I didn't know existed, and for having the courage to challenge my assumptions when it would have been easier to accept them. Elena smiled, her expression reflecting both satisfaction and continued determination. Marcus, you've proven that growth and change are possible when people are willing to examine their beliefs honestly and act on what they learn. But this is just the beginning. Real organizational transformation takes years of consistent effort and continued learning. As they talked about future challenges and opportunities, Marcus realized that his relationship with Elena had evolved into something unique in his professional experience. A true partnership based on mutual respect, shared values, and complementary strengths. She had become not just a consultant or mentor, but a colleague whose insights continued to expand his understanding of what effective leadership could accomplish. Walking back through the city streets toward Meridian Corp, where both of their careers were now flourishing in ways they hadn't imagined possible, Marcus thought about the lesson that Elena's story had taught him about the complexity and dignity of human potential. The woman he had dismissed as a cleaning supervisor had become the architect of his success as a leader, not through charity or good intentions, but through the recognition and development of capabilities that had always existed but had never been acknowledged. The transformation of Marcus Williams from a conventionally successful executive to an innovative leader had required him to abandon comfortable assumptions about hierarchy, merit, and human potential. But that transformation had created possibilities not just for his own advancement, but for the advancement of everyone whose talents have been overlooked by traditional organizational approaches. As Marcus settled into his new role as vice president, he carried with him Elena's challenge to continue learning, growing, and questioning assumptions about how organizations could better serve both human potential and business success. The promotion he had achieved was satisfying, but the partnership he had built and the principles he had discovered would shape every decision he made for the rest of his career. The story that had begun with casual dismissal had become one of mutual recognition, professional growth, and the kind of success that could only be achieved when people were willing to see beyond surface appearances to recognize the full complexity and potential of human capability. Marcus had learned that true leadership required not just vision and competence, but the humility to learn from unexpected teachers and the courage to act on insights that challenge conventional wisdom. In the end, Elena Rodriguez had given Marcus Williams more than career advice or organizational insights. She had given him a new understanding of what it meant to be successful in ways that created value for others as well as himself. And perhaps most importantly, she had shown him that the most profound transformations often began with the simple decision to really see the people whose work and wisdom made success possible.